So I get to ask you some questions, but before I start, I said last night, and I want to say in front of Hank, there were many heroes in the crisis who got us through it, but the hero is the gentleman to my left. I lived it, I saw it, and in my darkest days, to have the Secretary Treasurer call and encourage you and keep you pumped up meant a lot to me. I want to thank you for that. Hank and I had the opportunity about 6 months ago to be together, and we chatted privately before he did a Q&A at a conference. And two things, Hank, that you said to me have stuck with me. Number one, and I understand it now after reading your book, you said President Bush was a great leader and how he helped you through that. And number two, you and I talked a little bit about the emotional impact it had clearly on you and also on me. If you would just talk about leadership from the president and then a little bit about the emotional impact.
John, thank you. Let me first say to everybody, I'm just delighted to be here at NYU, just delighted to be here. And secondly, you've heard me say it a lot, but you were a really strong leader during the crisis, and boy, it tested all of us. Now, in terms of the president, and I think those of you who've read the book could see this on a second-hand basis. And it disappoints some of those who want to believe a caricature of George Bush, which is not attractive. The president was engaged, understood the markets, and what impressed me about him all the way through the crisis was that this is a man who's not a fan of Wall Street, not a fan of the GSEs, is someone who clearly didn't go to Washington to bail out banks, but he understood how important it was to our economy and to jobs to do what needed to be done. And so he was engaged, he was encouraging, and rather than making life difficult for me, he was very supportive. And one of the things that John and I had talked about was that when a Treasury Secretary goes to Washington, you can have any agreement with the president. And I'd worked to make sure we had an understanding that I would be the primary advisor and spokesman on domestic and international economic issues. But if I didn't have a relationship with the president, he didn't trust me, that agreement meant nothing. And I had a year, I was very fortunate before the crisis, for us to get to know each other, for him to understand that I'm pretty direct behind closed doors, but that publicly there wouldn't be daylight between us and so on. Now, as to, and the other thing which I appreciated a lot was he rather than making life difficult, he encouraged and bucked me up, and there were times when he practically mothered me, to get me through this. Now, secondly, which has to do with the emotional response, I think John and I were talking about the most stressful occasions, and it's whether you're managing a firm on the brink or an economy on the brink, or the anxiety that goes with all of the uncertainty, and particularly when you don't have all many things are beyond your control. And so it is, and then understanding if you're running a firm and you just realize what happens if the firm collapses and what it means to all the lives you affect within that company. And if you're a Treasury Secretary who's run one of those banks, you understand that, and you also understand what it means to the country and to the American people. And we were going through a period where I very much believed then, and I believe now, that if we'd had one other major firm go down after Lehman Brothers, it would have taken down the rest, and we would have gone into something that with unemployment, I think, equal to what we had in the Great Depression. And so the anxiety I felt was, I certainly didn't want to be presiding over in a con and AB Treasury Secretary when everything collapsed and we went into another depression. But these were very emotional times. In addition, it wasn't just looking at numbers and making tough, cold decisions. It was knowing what the human impact would be.
Hank, in your book, you talk about a little bit on the president, I think a little bit of humor that he had. You're in a meeting, you always turned your phone off in meetings, but somehow you forgot, you put your jacket off to the side, you're in with one of the dignitaries from another country, the phone rings, and you search all over, and what does the president say to you?
Oh yeah. It's funny now. It wasn't funny at the time because George Bush was, as I said, easy to work with, but his pet peeve were cell phones and Blackberries, and we all knew to turn them off. And he liked to start meetings on time or early, so I timed it, how quickly I could make it from my office at Treasury to his office. And it was about 2.5 minutes, and I'd leave in a dead run, and the Secret Service would catch up with me. And I was late for a meeting. I got there in time, and it was with a head of state, and I was sitting on a couch on one side of the president, between Condi and I forgot who was on Condi Rice and who was on the other side. And my cell phone was in, I don't know why I left my cell phone on and left it in my right pocket on the pants leg, where I never put it. And so when the phone started to ring, I couldn't find it. I patted myself down. I stood up and started to look under the couch seat. And Condi, who was sitting next to me, put her hand right there and said, "It's right here." She could hear it. So I took it out and turned it off. And he told me, he said, "Well, that was a 3-bagger, with the president in the Oval Office with the head of state, and you couldn't find it." So.
Hank, you mentioned in your book at a meeting with the C100, a group focusing on China-U.S. relationship, that at that time you said we have the subprime market contained, but then later clearly we were all wrong. Why do you think we were so off on what the problem was?
Yeah, John, I get asked that question a lot because the very first major meeting I had with the president, I talked about the likelihood of a credit crisis. And he said, "What would cause it?" And I said, "Sir, it's almost impossible to determine beforehand. Afterwards, it just becomes obvious to everybody. Who would have thought Russia was going to default in 98 or whatever?" Well, I think the reason we missed this, I think people could see there was a problem in the subprime market. But I think the reason we missed it was that ever since World War II, residential housing prices have generally gone up in the United States. And we haven't had a big nationwide decline in housing prices. So none of the mortgages were considered to be safe investments. And so the economists didn't have it in their models, the rating agencies didn't have it in their models, and that you would have this big decline in housing prices, which would change behaviors and many things that we hadn't seen before. So when we looked at the size of subprime relative to a 13 or 14 trillion dollar U.S. economy, it looked like it was contained, but it was a spark that lit all that dry tinder out there and ignited the whole thing. And then this was housing; it wasn't subprime.
Right. There's one point you talk about a conversation you and Wendy were having, and she kind of said, you're talking what's wrong, and you talk about, well, I'm worried about the world falling apart.
Yeah.
Describe to us the world falling apart.
Well, I would say the conversations you're alluding to, I don't think, at the time when I had that conversation, I was being about 80% serious, but this was before Bear Stearns, and I had not, that was Bear Stearns weekend, and we were at a social event, and I was doing one of these things where I look right past people, and she was trying to introduce me to friends, and I would say hi and then be off someplace else, and And so she was taking me to task for it, and I said, "Here, you want me to know all these people's names, and I'm worried about the world falling apart." But let me tell you what I think, where I really was worried and understood how serious it was in the world falling apart, and that was, John, the week that Lehman gone down, that Merrill Lynch had been acquired, AIG had been rescued, bailed out, whatever you want to call it, with a Fed loan. We had the money markets funds ready to implode, $3.5 trillion of it. You know, liquidity pouring out of Morgan Stanley. And so I knew we were on the brink, and what really drove it home to me was when you had blue chip industrial companies unable to sell their commercial paper for, roll it over for more than a day. And so, and I knew right then that the CFOs were talking with CEOs and saying, we're going to have to cut back our funding for the next 30 days because we may not all be there. And so if it had collapsed, you would have industrial companies of all size not be able to fund their inventories, pay their suppliers, pay employees. Employees couldn't have paid their bills. That would have rippled through the economy. I think unemployment would have been 25% or greater. I think you would have we would have lost trillions more in savings. This would have been Armageddon. Now, I think part of the problem we had, and part of the problem we still have with credibility and credibility with the American people, is when we're at that point in time. Ben Bernanke knew, Tim Geithner knew, I knew the economy was going to turn down, 6 weeks, 8 weeks later, significantly, because the capital markets were frozen. But Congress didn't know that. And so we had to convince them largely on faith that if they didn't give us the powers, something really bad was going to happen. We got the powers, we acted, and something really bad did happen. Right. But the question was, so it's as Barney Frank explained to me at the time, you're never going to get credit for staving off a disaster that doesn't occur. Right. So the disaster didn't happen. They've got to see a serious situation. And so that was what I envisioned in terms of the system. Institutions are so much concentration. The big institutions go down, it would have been so hard to put things back together again. Mm-hmm. That's what I was worried about. But I wasn't quite there. I was very concerned with Wendy, but I was just also pushing her back a little.
Okay. So, Hank, a number of us have been to Washington, and we've talked about what needs to be done, especially on the regulatory side. And one of the things that I know I've talked about in Washington is consolidating the regulators. You talk about it in your book.
Yeah.
It seems so difficult. There are barriers. Give us some insight. What are the barriers?
Oh, well, I'd say I think the thing that was so unique during the crisis, and because of the trust that Ben, Tim, and I had in each other, was to have organizations work as closely as they're working together. Because you see right now the turf fighting among the individual regulators as they fight. John, the biggest thing I learned in the first year going to Washington, and I'm sure I should have known beforehand, but I didn't, was just how arcane and almost bizarrely arcane and outdated our regulatory system was, and just a patchwork quilt that had been put together over the years with gaping holes and with overlap. And you had, just in terms of the prudential regulation, you have, in addition to the Fed and the FDIC, you've got the OCC and the OTS, and it's and we also had the SEC then with the with the investment banks, and you had 5 different regulators, and institutions would trade one regulator off against the other. I mean, part of the problem with AIG was you had this holding company on top of the regulated insurance companies, and no regulator was able to look at the whole situation. So, and the lack of power. So, I do think in terms of what needs to get done now, and I'm optimistic today that it is going to get done. And if it doesn't, I would say heaven help our country, because you're always going to have, as you and I and everyone who's been in markets know, you're always going to have periods of stress and turbulence, right, crises in the market. You're always going to have, no matter how good the regulation is, you're always going to have financial institutions fail. And so the two things I've been hitting is not just the consolidation, which we greatly need, and strong, consolidated, prudential, safety and soundness regulator for the big institutions. But I think we need, and I think Congress is moving in that direction, a systemic risk regulator that can look at any institution, regardless of type, and when they see any type of business activity that it threatens the system, that they've got, first of all, they've got access to all the information they need to monitor the markets, and then they can come in and restrain it, when there's a need to. And so we don't have just regulators focusing on the trees. We got someone on the whole forest. Mm-hmm. And then we need, which is really important, because no matter how good the regulators are, there will still be these problems, and we need resolution authority so that any institution, no matter how big, it's not too big to fail. That if they fail, then the regulator has the authority outside of the bankruptcy process to liquidate it. And it's not an easy matter. I think that regulators are going to be trained. It will take time, but they can be liquidated so they will not be propped up and preserved in their initial form. And I think even having to work with a regulator on a roadmap for how they'd be liquidated if they have to be, because otherwise you'll never have the market discipline. You'll have a moral hazard.
So take that one more step outside of the United States, into Europe, into Asia. One of the things that clearly I believe, and I think you also believe, let's assume we get it right here, but it has to be right globally.
Right.
Is our European friends, partners, Asian partners, are they focused on the seriousness of this global connectivity?
Well, John, I talked about our issues in the United States getting it right. I think the architecture outside of the U.S. is also challenging. The markets are global. I think with sovereign nations, you're never going to have a global regulation, but it's got to be harmonized. The myth is that this was a crisis in the U.S. I mean, Europe. This was a U.S. and Europe. That I think capital is very important. I think liquidity. One of the things I learned is even more important in liquidity cushions and so on. The Europeans, I think, they're a little bit behind in terms of where their institutions are in terms of recognizing the losses and so on, and they're not as well capitalized as in the U.S. So they've tended to emphasize other things. But I do think that I'm optimistic that we'll eventually get there. But I do think there should be a common set of standards. And also, I don't think we have to be very careful we don't use, regulation went from being considered bad to now being considered good. And we do need regulation, and it's always been very, very necessary. But it also can be used as a protectionist measure. Mm-hmm. So to be able to say, okay, in Europe, it only is going to work if we use European rating agencies, or if credit default swaps in Europe are traded on a European exchange, mm-hmm. or if we got different capital rules if you make loans in a country. And I think that would be a bad use of regulation. So I think there's a challenge to get this right and make sure we have harmonized, unified, tough clear regulation and that it's not used as a protectionist measure.
Just along those lines, you have a wonderful relationship in China, and during the crisis, you made a visit there and spoke to our friend Wan Xishan. After everything that we have been telling the Chinese about free markets and deregulation and trading, can you share any comments that he gave to you? Kind of, I think when I met with him, he said something to the effect, now the student is teaching the teacher, is what he said to me.
Well, he didn't say it quite that way to me. What he said to me was, well, the teacher right now, we now see the teacher has more problems, and so now the student is not quite sure what to do. So he didn't say the student was teaching the teacher, but it was the same point. Now, and I'd say two or three things about that. The first is that it was humbling to go through something like this, where the first time there was a global crisis and the spark was lit in the U.S. and we had the problems we had in the U.S., so that was humbling, number one. Number two, a little bit like I said about the relationship with George Bush, I had a chance to develop that beforehand. I'm very grateful we had the SED in place for a year, virtually, before the credit crisis. So we had these lines of communication and building up trust throughout the government, because China was quite constructive and helpful throughout this. But thirdly, what I say to the Chinese, I do believe they need to get to the point where they've got being as integrated as they are into the global economy in terms of goods and services. And they've got more work to get there in their currency, reforming their currency and having a market-determined currency, and having open, competitive capital markets. And I explained to them I didn't think it was fair to use a credit crisis as a way to keep reducing or not opening up the markets to competition, because in China, they'll set the regulations. It is that any foreign bank competing in China will operate under the same set of regulations that the Chinese choose and that their banks choose. So I pressed hard on opening up capital markets in China, not because I was trying to do a favor for the bankers, but because I believed that to help with some of the structural issues and some of the structural imbalances and other things, and to develop more domestic consumption and have a economy that was less dependent on low-cost, low-value-added exports, that having strong capital markets would make a difference. And I would always use the example with the Chinese about the poor Chinese citizens who were savers and were putting monies in their banks and getting something like 2% interest, less than inflation, and when everyone else was getting these high rates of returns in China. And that's why they need to save so much. So I think there's a lot that they could still learn in terms of opening up their capital markets. But you're right. I heard a lot about the teacher and the student, and he was right to some extent.
Just on the international piece, let's stay there for a while. In your book, it talked about Russians giving advice or trying to encourage the Chinese to sell a lot of their debt in Fannie and Freddie. And last night, when I was here, one of the students asked me, is there any person or thing you're really angry about? And I made the comment, no, it's business, and I moved on. But when I read that in your book, what was your reaction when you were told that?
Well, just to recount this for the students, I believe that really the most important thing we did was stabilizing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which were responsible for about 40 to 50% of the mortgage financing in the U.S. before the crisis, and virtually all of it after, when we're in the crisis. And so they had $5.4 trillion of securities that were outstanding in the U.S. and around the world. And their securities had an implicit, in many investors' mind, government support or guarantee. And so these were poorly structured and were accidents waiting to happen, but they were just a key part of the financial system. So if they had collapsed, it would have been terrible. And so we worked very hard to get Congress to give us the authorities we needed, which were unlimited. I didn't say unlimited. That would have been hard to get them. We talked about unspecified. But it was to get these authorities. And then there was, once we got them, and then hired Morgan Stanley, who did an absolutely superb job, and Bob Scully and Ruth Porat and a number of people who helped get inside and understand the extent of the problem, which we'd had. We then realized we had a race to stabilize this before Lehman was going to announce their earnings and some other things were happening. Otherwise, it would have been a terrible situation. So it was when I was in China that I learned that the Russians had approached the Chinese with the idea that maybe they could together sell some securities. Now, I didn't, it would have been maybe they were going to test our resolve or whatever. It would have been quite destabilizing. John, I didn't have time in any of these things to get angry. I thought it probably wouldn't happen, but so many things that I hoped didn't happen had happened. And so I just was quite eager to move as quickly as we could to stabilize them.
If you go back again to that weekend, we were called down to the New York Federal Reserve, and we talked about the banks helping, originally Bank of America and then Barclays with the bad assets, and the surprise that we all had, I think it was on Sunday, when either the FSA or the Bank of England kind of stopped Barclays. Right. Talk about that and the surprise when you heard that.
Right. Well, again, with what we'd learned with Bear Stearns, which is an investment bank, and when they were failing, what we learned clearly, we didn't have the resolution authorities to wind them down outside of bankruptcy. And we recognized as we got into this that since the government had no power to guarantee liabilities, we only got that with a Tarp or put in capital, that although the Fed could help with liquidity, that we realized unless we'd had a buyer like J.P. Morgan to guarantee the trading book during the pendency of the shareholder vote, that we weren't going to be able to save Bear Stearns. So with Lehman, we knew we needed a buyer, and we were hopeful that would be Bank America. Now, of course, as you and I know, that if Bank America had bought Lehman, then it would have been who was going to deal with Merrill Lynch, because we were hit with three things in one weekend. But when B of A dropped, Barclays expressed strong interest, and they came in rather late, but we were leaving no stones unturned, and that was the last stone. And so we had a group of banks and investment banks to help fund the unwanted assets, and hopefully Barclays is a buyer. And then we learned from the FSA on Sunday that they weren't going to approve this. Now, at the time, when I write the book, anybody that's written a book, one of the real temptations is to write what you know now. But what you have to do is, what was I thinking then? And then what I did was I was frustrated and angry, and so I went into the room with a bunch of people and said, the British screwed us. Now, that wasn't something a Treasury Secretary should have said. And actually, as I've thought about it afterwards, I have no idea what I would have done if the roles were reversed. Looking at, unless you've walked in another man's shoes, and that's one thing you learn. The more you get along with this, if the roles were, because I very much respected the people on the other side, but that was frustration because we were out of options. Sure. This was our last option, and we got ourselves quite hopeful that the night before, and then to come in on Sunday, and it was also that room, to walk into that room, and I mean, I don't think anybody quite knew it was going to be as bad as it was, but
right.
All of us knew something about the markets, knew it was going to be bad.
Sure. I said earlier when we started chatting about Hank and the role he played, and just again on a personal note, I would get a call from Hank, and this is leading up to a question. I'd get a call from Hank, how are you doing, what's going on, what are your ideas, what are your options? And at the end he'd always say, we're going to get through this. We're going to get through it. We need independent investment banks. I'm working on it. And he did. So someone said to me later, and things got worse, at least at our firm, what was the low point for you, John Mack? The low point is when Hank, who'd been really keeping me pumped up, called on a Saturday and said, look, John, I think you really do need to do something with your firm, and that is in his book. So from my perspective, I said, gosh, my ally, the person who kept me running along with just looking at the faces of people at Morgan Stanley, it had real impact. The next day, as he says in the book, there was a conversation where Hank, Ben Bernanke, and Tim Geithner had me on the phone and asking me, Tim, to sell the firm. And I said, well, I won't do it. I'll take the firm down, is what I said. And Hank's called me when he was writing his book. He said, well, how did we end the conversation? I said, well, I hung up. So, Hank, what was your reaction?
Well, I've got to say to John to begin with that I am, as you know, just delighted that Morgan Stanley wasn't sold, because we've got so much concentration in the industry. That's really the last thing we need now. But what I was dealing with right then and there was, just to set the scene, this was a time when I believed if Morgan Stanley were to go down, or any major institution would go down, I believed we were going to go into a Great Depression. Okay, it just would have, the system, and to me that seems almost obvious given what happened after Lehman, right, and how fragile everything was. And so I was in the mode of doing everything we can to reduce the likelihood of something very bad happening, uncertainty. So the conversation we talked about was, you were telling me about Mitsubishi as a potential buyer, a Japanese bank. And so I've been around long enough to know that that's less than certainty, okay? It was going to be, the plan B was holding company and getting capital partners. And so that was one where where the Fed had been working on J.P. Morgan as a potential buyer, and before we'd gotten on the phone with you, Ben, Tim, and I had gotten on with J.P. Morgan, and again they were saying no, and you said no, and I know you talked with them a couple times before, and so I wasn't angry, unhappy, anything. I was just what are we going to do? Because I had pretty much known before we got on that wasn't going to happen, and I was already saying, what do we do to get through the night? Does the Fed made you and Goldman Sachs Bank holding companies? You announced a deal with Mitsubishi on Monday, Goldman Sachs sometime later, so you got Warren Buffett, you both had capital partners, and then you remember you and I sweated that right until
we really did.
I had to assure the Japanese government. I mean, it just didn't get any, and it's if you weren't there living it, it's just very hard to understand it.
It is hard to understand unless you were actually right there. We've all especially recently, some of us have been called down to Washington and been grilled. We've seen you on TV a few times being grilled.
It's not a pretty sight.
No, it's hard stuff. But you get through it. You're very patient. Kind of take us through again. How did you stay so calm and so focused? You really understood the issues. You're not playing politics. You're doing what's right. And others sometimes are playing politics. How did you navigate that?
Well, I would say this, John, that the other thing, I had and I'm really grateful for this, I had a year before the crisis. If I'd come down there and got hit by the crisis, it would have just been terrible. I had a year, and the president agreed with my advice that I not be involved in any political activities, no campaigning. Right. So I was able to say to the Democrats, just like Republicans, you're my clients. So I had time to develop and build relationships with them. It's hard sometimes when people say one thing to you in private and you're good friends, and then the camera goes on and they say something else. But you have to learn that's, and maybe I was there too long, but you learn to accept it, and that's part of what you go through. And I've never seen any, one of the stories I talk about in the book was with Fannie and Freddie, and that I had this conversation with Chris Dodd because he said, we'll have a hearing. And I said, but how are we going to work something out in a hearing? And of course, we both were right, because there's, how naive can you be to expect you weren't going to, it wasn't going to take hearings before you got the authorities. And of course, you never work anything out in a hearing. So I sit there, and let me tell you, every now and then, people would see smiles on my face because I would think of something that I'd like to say, and it would amuse me, or they'll see me fighting back other things. But you just, if ever I get angry or just blurt something out, it's my fault, because that's a game where you just really need to be very careful.
Hank, in your book, you talked about at Goldman Sachs, and you would encourage your young partners about, I'll call it conspicuous consumption, to be low key. Today, I think the reputation of Wall Street, at least in my 40 years, is the lowest I've ever seen. With your experience in Wall Street, then going to Washington, and as you pull away and look back, what do you think Wall Street needs to do to repair their reputation?
I wish I knew. You go back from the beginning of time. I was reading, as long as there have been capital markets, not the beginning of time, but as long as there have been capital markets and banks, when there are, this isn't to excuse the mistakes that have been made on Wall Street, because there's just a lot of blame to go around, and plenty on Wall Street, and the regulatory system, housing policies in the United States. We could list all the things, but from the beginning of markets, the reason there's so many overseas Chinese is because they would kill the bankers in the old days there when there were problems. There's always going to be problems. I think that that banks and capital markets are so important. They've taken hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. There's so much good they do. So the question is, how does it come back? And I think slowly, and just remembering the things that you and I know and have talked about, that that capital markets are based on confidence, and investor confidence and trust comes from doing not only what's legally required and obeying the letter of the law, but that is doing what's right and feels right, and being able to make the necessary changes, acknowledge when there have been mistakes, but then move on. And I think that part of one thing that all of us missed, I talked with to a group of press the other night, a dinner which where the press was being, self-critical. What could we have done better, and so on. And a number of people said one of the things they missed was the anger in the American public that all of us missed, because we never made the connection between Wall Street and Main Street. Mm-hmm. I was never able to communicate that. I certainly didn't go. I wasn't trying to bail out any bank or an investment bank. The reason we did this was because of the American people were going to pay the price if the system collapsed, and that point wasn't made. Mm-hmm. And so in our country, we've all learned that when people take risks, the risk takers bear the losses. Right. And of course, now that it's in the banks and with all these, and I think compensation has always been out of whack. I think you and I both believe that on Wall Street. And now after what's happened, I think people are understandably angry. And so that's why I press so hard for this regulatory reform and the resolution authority, because I think we can never go through a period again where taxpayer money comes in to do anything other than liquidate.
Okay. I have one more question, but we're going to go to the audience. I'm going to leave my question last. So I think if people do have questions, there's a mic. Hank's willing to answer questions for another 15 minutes or so. So if anyone has a question.
Secretary Paulson, you were successful in passing some pretty substantial legislation with pretty impressive bipartisan support. Given the current state of the Congress and Washington in general, do you see any potential for passing financial regulation, reform, anything like that in the next 12 to 24 months, or if indeed that's necessary at this stage?
Well, good question. I am optimistic. Maybe I'm naive, but I'm optimistic that the right people are working on it. The administration is making a big effort. There's some support on both sides of the aisle for getting the regulatory reform we talked about. The resolution authority, systemic risk regulator, working things out in terms of consumer and investor protection in some form. I'm optimistic about that. In terms of what you're really asking, which is it possible to get really, really difficult, controversial, important things done up there? And one of the lessons I learned is it's virtually impossible to get this done unless there's a crisis. And to me, it's a huge tragedy as it relates to the fiscal deficit, the big embedded deficit in Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And we'll solve this someday as a country, but the longer we wait, the more we're going to hurt the younger generation. And in families, parents are willing to make big sacrifices for their children. In our country, we don't seem to be, this just seems to be more of a focus on the older generation. So I'm concerned about that. And it took a impending crisis. I worked on Fannie and Freddie legislation for over a year. It took an impending crisis to get it done. With the Tarp, the House, when the system ready to melt down, the House voted no the first time. Now I'm grateful because I think it was a courageous vote for everyone up there, because there's sort of two themes in my book. One is the speed at which things are hitting us, and the other is the collision of politics and markets. And an election we were doing this in the face of an election a number of weeks away. So every politician had to have one eye on the electorate, and that's his job, and the other on the policy. And we had the support of both presidential candidates and the Republican and the Democratic leadership of both the House and the Senate. And without that, we would have been defenseless. And we got it before the collapse. And so I think that was very difficult to do, and I think it's one of the things I'm most sad about is that how difficult it looks to deal with the other major issues we have to deal with as a country without a crisis.
Let's go here.
First of all, thank you very much, sir, for coming.
Get a little closer to the mic, please.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm a part-time student. My name is Miraj Oza, and I appreciate your leadership during the tumultuous time. My question is that what is your take on the euro as a currency? And it has a common central bank but not a common treasury. Do you think it's a viable model?
This the UK? The EU, you said?
The euro as a
The euro, absolutely.
He has a position on it.
I'm going to say, I'm going to say two things. Okay, first, as a former Treasury Secretary, I'm careful what I say about currency, and because I always worked very, very hard for a strong dollar, because I'm so convinced that makes sense in the U.S. And you've pointed to a major challenge. And I just don't want to make news on that topic. But it is, you've said it, because the European Union is, I'm very supportive of the European Union. But we look at our challenges right now in Congress, and when you have a series of sovereign nations who have the ultimate responsibility, that just makes their challenge that much more difficult. But I would say you would have to give them a lot of credit so far for how well that union is performed over a period of time, and the crisis just has stressed a lot of architecture and a lot of relationships in ways that are unpleasant.
Let's go over here. You can tell Hank's been in Washington with that answer.
Hi, my name is Ranbir Tukral. I'm a student at NYU Stern. It's great having you here, hearing about your experiences, how you handle the crisis. My question is on the deployment of the Tarp funds. There's a very strong feeling that there was a lot of time wasted in deployment of these funds. Initially, the thinking was that the funds should be used to buy the toxic assets, and later on it was changed to capitalizing the banks. Do you think if the Fed had stuck to capitalizing the banks right at the beginning, we would have saved some valuable time and averted a lot of the damage?
Oh, absolutely not. That's, to me, obvious. We had been thinking about going to Congress for some time, and as you pointed out, the initial thought was to buy in illiquid assets, and we believed if we did that, it would have some interesting advantages in terms of price discovery and having capital go into those markets. We went to Congress with that idea. I don't believe we could have gone to Congress any earlier, and I believe if we'd gone to Congress and said, let's put capital in the banks, there would have immediate been talk of nationalization, and it'd be very interesting to see if there ever even would have been legislation. But we went there. We were careful to make sure we had broad authorities. And when we were up at the Hill, it became clear to us that the problem was even bigger than we had anticipated. That we lost Washington Mutual, we lost Wachovia when we were working to get the TARP. And now, when we got it on October 3rd, we then had, over a sort of a 2-week period here, we had 6 European nations need to come in and rescue their banks. So we needed to do something that was dramatic and really had an impact. And I would say the one thing that I just don't believe anyone could have implemented any better, any quicker, was to get the TARP on October 3rd, and by Columbus Day have announced a program and have 9 banks with over 50% of the assets take $125 billion of capital and be done. I mean, people, and so that was very significant. Now, I had hoped and anticipated that we'd get up to 2,000 to 3,000 banks take capital. And but of course, as soon as we announced this, critics immediately started saying, you need to make them lend. No one explained, how much was enough lending and what the government was supposed to do to make them lend. And then critics started saying, demanding that we force them to lend and put other restrictions on. And, so over time this got stigmatized. And so rather than having 3,000 banks, we had less than 700, but it made a difference. And rather than having the banks keep the capital for 3 to 5 years, they rushed to pay it back. So I'd say the program was a big success and that it stabilized the market. It worked. It prevented a collapse. But if the capital had been outstanding, had gone to 3,000 banks, have been outstanding for several years, it would have done more to get this economy going than any of the other programs being talked about. And a lot of the people that criticized the program for not having more strings attached to it are those that say it failed because there's not more lending. And so, but I think we moved as quickly as humanly possible, and we changed as the facts changed and as we understood the facts.
Good evening. My name is Betsy Corona. I'm a part-time student. My question is a topic that we've been talking a lot about tonight, regulatory reform. Specifically, I'm interested in your position on two very hot topics in Washington right now, the Volcker Rule, which would limit, of course, prop trading, and then the CFPA. Dodd most recently, the word on the street is that most recently they're considering putting it in, having some agency, consumer regulatory agency, in the Fed. What are your positions on the Volcker Rule and the CFPA?
Right. Well, what I've said about the Volcker Rule is I'm not for it. I was one of the several Treasury Secretaries that didn't sign the letter. I have great respect for Paul Volcker, and I have great respect for what he's trying to do. But one of the things that I saw up close and personal in Washington is what happens when you write too many narrow rules or try to design something for a particular period of time. And so I believe first of all, if we'd had the Volcker Rule, it would have made no difference with Fannie, Freddie, Lehman, AIG, Washington Mutual, Wachovia, etc. But secondly, I think we need broad authority. And so that I would like a systemic risk regulator to be able to intervene, to get all the information they need and intervene on any type of institution with any type of business activity. Trading, if there's, or the areas that really cause the problem, and limit it if it's necessary. So that's number one. Now, in terms of consumer and investors, these are not ideas that we just came up with now. I mean, one of the things we did right was right away when I got to Washington, it became clear to me how really screwed up the regulatory system was. We started working on it, and by the end of March 2008, we had a regulatory blueprint that dealt with these things. So there's no doubt that the credit crisis exposed real flaws in terms of consumer protection. And so this was something, we emphasized the need for that in the blueprint. I don't favor, and never did, sort of putting a new agency on top of this other hodgepodge. We'd had an idea that had to do with the Consumer Oversight, Mortgage Oversight Commission, looking at mortgages, because a lot of the problems with mortgages were at the state level where they weren't adequately regulated. So we had an idea there. But in terms of the consumer protection, my own view is that if what I'm reading in the papers is true, they're starting to come together. And I would not focus as much on if it was part of the Fed or Treasury or anything else, because one of the things I learned as Treasury Secretary is when you have an independent regulator as part of your organization, there's a lot of authority. So to me, it's how that's drafted. And if there's a presidential appointee and if it's And if the funding is separate, and it is, I think that's where the focus should be, and I think it's important that it be done properly. And I think people on both sides of the aisle have the same objective, so I'm hopeful they'll work something out.
Hi, my name's Michael Rosner. I'm a part-time student here, and my question's about credit default swaps. I know there's a lot of debate, whether people see them as causes of some of the things we've gone through, or more just a symptom of some of the weaker firms. I remember, leading up to the bear weekend being sold, the credit default swaps were really blowing out, and that was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But then kind of everyone let their guard down, and then it came back with a vengeance. And also, I guess the question is, with the Greece episode recently, that same thing, you had like these speculators essentially coming in and bidding up the credit default swaps, also almost leading to a self-fulfilling prophecy of sovereign default until France and Germany came in to guarantee the debt. So I guess my question is, do you think that credit default swaps played what role they played in the crisis? And do you think that they've played a proper role, or they're just a function of the underlying trends, or that they really kind of exacerbated the existing issues?
Well, in my book, when I explain that I talked to the president about when I thought we were overdue for a credit crisis, the area I focused on was credit default swaps. And what I was focusing on there was the lack of transparency, the fact that the plumbing didn't work. There'd been a lot of work that was done, but we didn't have great protocols for how they would work. I believe that they are a very useful tool, that they are a very important risk mitigant, and I can give you many examples. If a sovereign nation wants to hedge its oil prices out a number of years, or just all kinds of examples. Airlines hedging their fuel costs. So they're very valuable tools, and they were, I think, at times during the crisis, they were risk transmitters in addition to risk mitigants. And so my view is that on something like this is that the administration has got the right plan, that most of them are standardized. They should be traded on exchanges. I happen to believe that complexity was a big part of the problem. I don't think it's very hard to legislate or regulate against innovation, so I would just do this with capital charges. So if they're not standardized and you put them on a central clearing exchange, a clearinghouse, that there also be, if they're complex, that you put a capital charge on it, so that you penalize them and make sure that there's plenty of capital. Now, in terms of in terms of legal issues and collusion and so on, I'm going to leave this to the Justice Department and regulators. When I was there in the middle of the crisis, it sure didn't look like it looked like a pack of wolves going after individual firms. In other words, if it was just an industry in general, then maybe all the investment banks would have weakened at one time, or a number of them would have. But it was going after the slowest steer, and then the next slowest steer, and so it looked like a serial attack to me. But I'm not saying that there's anything illegal. That would be, some investigator would have to find, collusive behavior. But it certainly was counterproductive, and it went from being a mitigant of risk. There were times when I think they were transmitters of risk during the crisis.
I'm sorry, I know you have other questions, but we have a time frame, and I get the last question, okay. So I apologize. Yeah. So Andrew Sorkin, Too Big to Fail, tells me that there's most likely going to be a movie made of Too Big to Fail. It's clear in talking to him that De Niro is going to play me. There's talk that Danny DeVito is going to be Lloyd. So my question is, who should play you in the movie?
Oh my goodness. What I'd like to do is bring back a young Paul Newman as well. What I would do, but I'm afraid you'd have to bring back Yul Brynner, right?
Hank, thank you for a lot of things, this tonight, but really what you've done for our country. Thank
John,
you.
thank you. Thank you.